Have you ever looked at the world around you and felt like nothing is in your control? Like we're all part of some theatrical playbook?
That the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Have you ever felt like your fears and desires are under constant assault? Or like you're some sort of puppet being forced through a way of life you didn't ask for?
It's part of the whole ideology of this age, which is power mad.
Maybe you've even questioned whether you're the one losing your mind. I'm here to tell you, you're not. This sentiment is the product of something much more nefarious and orchestrated than you could possibly imagine. This is the story of how one man in the early 20th century decided you must be molded into a docile puppet of the system. This is the story of
Alright, I definitely need something to read off of for this one. It's a bit too much information just to freeball. Let me start by saying, please go watch Adam Curtis's docuseries, The Century of the Self. It's on YouTube for free, and it's where I got basically all the information for this video. I'm basically just going to try to condense a lot of Curtis's ideas and research into something that's slightly more palatable, while adding in some of my own research as well, and then like speculation on modern day. I know this is a long one. Very long. I think it's about an hour, and it's a little different from my past videos for sure, but I strongly encourage you to watch the full thing. There's just a lot to unpack, but I promise you if you stick with me, by the end of the video it'll kind of all come together and you'll start to see just like everything completely differently. Alright, let's get started. Most people do not really want freedom, because freedom involves responsibility. And most people are frightened of responsibility.
That was the stance taken by renowned Austrian neurologist Sigmund Freud at the beginning of the 20th century. Most of you probably recognize the name Freud from coursework you may have taken, controversial opinions of his talked about online, or at the very least heard of the term Freudian slip. What if I told you the only reason you even know about Freud is actually because of the devious work of his lesser-known American nephew, Edward Bernays? At the turn of the century, tensions across the globe were growing towards what would become an unprecedented world conflict. Meanwhile, in America, Edward Bernays was gripped by his uncle Sigmund's ideas on human behavior. He was particularly interested in his uncle's work on psychoanalysis and novel ideas on an unconscious mind being the primary component in an individual's decision-making process. His ideas postulated that the unconscious and irrational mind contained sexual and aggressive forces that the conscious and rational mind actively suppressed. By the summer of 1914, tensions in Europe erupted with the assassination of Austrian-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand.
The Great War had officially begun.
America was inevitably drawn into World War I by 1917. So President Woodrow Wilson established a committee on public information where Bernays was employed to push propaganda promoting America's goals both domestically and abroad. At the end of the war, Bernays watched the world celebrate President Wilson as a hero for democracy at the Paris Peace Conference. Seeing this sparked an idea that would radically reshape the world.
What if propaganda could be used during peacetime?
That if you could use propaganda for war, you could certainly use it for peace. And propaganda got to be a bad word because of the Germans using it. So what I did was to try to find some other words. So we found the word Council on Public Relations.
And so, with this first twisting of the truth, the father of public relations was born, along with his never-ending appetite to leverage the irrational mind and control the masses. One of Bernays' more sensational plots to monetize the unconscious mind was to break the taboo of woman smoking. This, of course, was only driven by the monetary gain that it promised him and his client, the American Tobacco Company,
which at the time was one of the most powerful companies in the US.
Bernays called up his psychoanalyst friend, A.A. Brill, who was an expert in practicing his uncle Sigmund Freud's techniques. He asked A.A. Brill for any insights he had on what cigarettes meant to women, to which he responded by saying they were a symbol of male sexual power. So all Bernays had to do was link the idea of smoking to challenging male sexual power. To do this, the 1929 New York City Easter Day Parade seemed as good a stage as any. Bernays hired some wealthy woman who would become the center of attention at the day's festivities. Before the parade began, Bernays warned the press about a group of suffragettes who were planning to protest by lighting up, quote, torches of freedom. Bernays stood quietly among the crowd, and with a subtle signal from him, the woman disclosed cigarettes hidden beneath their clothing and lit the torches of freedom for all the world to see.
And so he was ready with a phrase which was torches of freedom. And so here you have a symbol, women, young women, debutantes, smoking a cigarette in public with a phrase that means anybody who believes in this kind of equality pretty much has to support them in the ensuing debate about this, because torches of freedom. I mean, what's on all American coins? It's liberty. She's holding up the torch. You see? And so all of this is there together. There's emotion, there's memory, there's a rational phrase, even though it's using a lot of emotional elements. It's a phrase that works in a rational sense. All of this is together. And so the next day, this was not just in all of the New York papers, it was across the United States and around the world.
Bernays had tricked the world into the irrational idea that smoking somehow made women more independent, when in reality, it just made a few people richer
and a lot more people future cancer patients.
These events took place in the summer of 1929. By 1930, the American Tobacco Company's revenue had skyrocketed an unprecedented 43%. This was not some little social experiment Bernays had pulled off. He had shown his ideas to be more powerful and influential than anyone could have anticipated. By the end of the century, they will have found their way into nearly every facet of modern civilization. To fully grasp the amount of power this man was wielding, you must first understand the context in which Bernays was living. There are two key factors that gave him a uniquely opportune position. The first key factor is that the United States had just freshly exited the First World War, and large corporations were pumping out products at a rate that peacetime demand simply could not match. This was a growing concern for large corporations, since people were quickly accumulating all the goods they deemed necessary for their everyday lives. The second key factor is that up until this point in history, marketing was very different from what you're used to today. Goods and products were marketed purely on the basis of utility to the rational consumer. Do you want a new car? Here are all the specific features that this car has and the reasons you would want them. These two factors together meant big corporations needed to find a way to turn the system upside down. As Paul Mazur of the Lehman Brothers put it, they needed to shift Americans from a culture of needs to a culture of desire. And with the help of Edward Bernays, they did just that. New York banks began funding chains of department stores which became outlets for all of these mass-produced goods. Bernays began working with William Randolph Hearst to promote new women's magazines using articles and advertisements that linked products of his other clients to famous people. He dressed movie stars with clothes and accessories of other companies he worked with, telling these stars to repeat that dressing yourself
Was not just functional, but a way in which you could express yourself.
There's a psychology of dress. Have you ever thought about it? How it can express your character? You all have interesting characters, but some of them are all hidden. I wonder why you all want to dress always the same, with the same hats and the same coats. I'm sure all of you are interesting and have wonderful things about you, but looking at you in the street, you all look so much the same. And that's why I'm talking to you about the psychology of dress. Try and express yourselves better in your dress.
He had his automobile clients portray their cars not as useful machines, but rather as symbols that would magnify one's male sexual power. And just like that, Americans' first importance was no longer to their country as well-informed citizens, but to themselves as a consumer. Amidst all of this, Sigmund Freud was facing bankruptcy in Vienna and reached out to Bernays for financial help.
His nephew, of course, saw this not as an opportunity to help a family member, but rather an opportunity to serve his own interests.
Very little was known about Sigmund Freud outside of academia at the time, so Bernays agreed to help publish his uncle's books in the US and promote them using his trademark manipulative tactics. He was, of course, successful in his marketing, and soon everybody was talking about Freud's controversial ideas on sex and the unconscious mind. Freud was accepted into the zeitgeist, giving Bernays all the credibility he needed to persuade future clients into doing business with him. It was only a matter of time before Bernays worked his way into politics and government. That is exactly what happened in 1924 when the ill-perceived President Calvin Coolidge was running for re-election. The public saw Calvin Coolidge as a dry and dull man lacking any character, which gave him the idea to reach out to the one man who seemed to have mystical powers in swaying the minds of the people, Edward Bernays. Bernays convinced 34 film stars to visit Coolidge in the White House, accompanied by plenty of individuals from the press.
I'd say, "What's your name?" He'd say, "Al Jolson." I'd say, "Mr. President, Al Jolson." Next day, every newspaper in the United States had a front page story. President Coolidge entertains actors at White House. And the Times had a headline which said, "President nearly laughed." And everybody was happy.
This is all the people needed to see to happily re-elect him for a second term. Bernays had successfully molded every American citizen into an ideal consumer and simultaneously worked his way into a politically influential role. This change for America was not slowing down anytime soon.
Everybody. He knows the mayor and he knows the senator and he calls politicians on the telephone as if he did get literally a high or a bang out of doing what he did. If people did things in a way that he wouldn't have done them, they were stupid. It was a word that he used over and over and over, dope and stupid.
And the masses?
They were stupid.
Sigmund Freud did not have an optimistic view on human nature, to say the least.
He began writing about the dangerous forces lurking just below the surface of people, and he particularly warned of the volatility of large groups of people when confronted with the proper trigger. This began to worry many powerful people that an angry mob could be strong enough to overthrow an entire government. Political commentator Walter Lippmann proposed that the fundamental idea of democracy was in fact wrong in believing that people could be trusted to make decisions on a rational basis. He decided it was necessary to form a new elite that would use psychological tactics to control the masses and manage what he called
the, quote, bewildered herd.
Bernays agreed with Lippmann and began writing his own theories on how to practically achieve this. Bernays suggested flooding people with products to appease their inner desires and suppress the more dangerous forces lurking within. President Hoover promoted this idea and told the PR team that they had transformed the people, in his words, into, quote, constantly moving happiness machines. Democracy had been reshaped into a sort of de facto pseudo-democracy based solely on self-preservation. The elite could go about making the important decisions while the rest of us lay idle in a trance of satiating our own desires.
Meanwhile, Bernays became incredibly wealthy, hosting parties at his place in New York City accompanied by the mayor, senators, business tycoons, and anyone who was in a powerful position.
He would talk openly without any hesitation to his friends and family about how he thought people were stupid. While Bernays was basking in success, His uncle Freud was working on a new book that postulated the idea that civilization existed simply for survival and not as a mechanism for human progress. It suppressed true human desire, which in turn made true democracy impossible and led to the inevitable discontent of the individual. While Freud was working on his ideas in Austria, a young Adolf Hitler shared similar views on democracy in the neighboring country of Germany. Hitler believed that democracy inevitably led to selfish individualism and sought to control the individual, leveraging the unconscious mind in a completely new manner. The chief Nazi propagandist, Joseph Goebbels, sought to do exactly what Freud had warned about with irrational volatility in large groups. Goebbels organized enormous rallies to actually encourage these dangerous forces. The rallies were structured such that the people's deep desires were channeled towards their leader, and their aggressive instincts were channeled away from the group towards any outsiders. This deviously puppeted mob would only continue to grow in lethal power. On the other side of the world in America, the prosperity of the Roaring Twenties, built on the back of Edward Bernays and his elite, was all about to come tumbling down. The date is October 28th, 1929, also known as Black Monday. The stock market closes at a historical 13% loss. The next day, Black Tuesday, the US stock market closes at an additional 12% loss. In just 2 days, the market had plummeted an unprecedented 25%, and the Great Depression began. Almost immediately, Americans stopped buying things that they didn't absolutely need. Just making ends meet was a nearly impossible task for most. This caused the exact eruption of aggressive forces Freud had been warning about. In contrast to the mobs in Nazi Germany, America was directing its aggression towards those in power. Civil unrest spread across America as angry mobs began to blame the seemingly responsible corporations. For the time being,
Bernays and his posse of elites would have to take a step back, relinquishing their grip of control.
Americans were desperate for change. There was one man who was willing to take on the monumental task of unwinding the unprecedented economic damage America had suffered. His name, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, better known as FDR. FDR was a charismatic optimist who ran for president on the promise to have state-led relief programs for the unemployed while simultaneously regulating the corporations who had caused this economic catastrophe. FDR was elected, and Bernays fell even further into the background, but not for long. With the election of FDR, America was about to enter a new era. His New Deal program brought back many of the jobs lost due to the market crash. He passed the Social Security Act giving the elderly unemployment pensions, and he created the Securities and Exchange Committee to regulate the stock market and prevent future crashes from happening.
More important than any of those things, in my opinion, was that he took a complete counter-philosophy to Bernays.
He believed that people were fundamentally rational, and he wanted to have them partake in government as informed and trusted citizens. True democracy. He broadcasted a series of what he called fireside chats over the radio into the comfort of people's living rooms. He spoke using everyday language to demystify seemingly complex issues and policies for the common person. He worked closely with George Gallup to create an unbiased polling system that would allow the people to inform him of their opinions on his actions and performance as president. He wanted nothing more than the government to function as a conscious extension of rational citizens. Bernays, on the other hand, was not willing to let the rational mind regain control again so easily. When FDR ran for re-election on more regulation, Bernays and the corporations began accusing FDR as looking more and more like a dictator.
Roosevelt interferes with private enterprise and is running the country into debt for generations to come. The way to get recovery is to let business alone.
FDR still managed to get re-elected, but Bernays and his group weren't backing down so easily. Bernays and big businesses got together quietly, forming the National Association of Manufacturers. They agreed that they must find a way to link the idea of private industries to democracy. They sought to show the people that it was businesses and not politicians that created modern America. At the 1929 New York City World Fair, Bernays devised another trademark scheme in an effort to achieve this. At the center of the fair, they built a large white dome they called Democracy. Inside of this dome, they showcased a working model of future America, constructed by General Motors. This put the battle between government and business into full motion. The government released informative films warning about the manipulation of the press by big businesses and taught the people how to spot biased narratives. FDR pushed for active and informed citizenship, with the government reflecting Americans' rational capability, while Bernays and his posse pushed for having passive consumers constantly fulfilling their deepest subconscious desires. As this feud in America brewed between the powerful few, Europe was about to see the raw aggressive power that Bernays' toolkit could produce when in the hands of the wrong people. Freud fled to London with the annex of Austria, and shortly after, Germany invaded Poland. This was the beginning of a war campaign, more aggressive and hateful than anything anyone had ever seen. It was like an entire nation had fallen under a spell.
World War II had begun.
I can't.
It says here on your record that you had headaches and that you had crying spells.
Yes, sir. I believe in your profession is called nostalgia.
In other words, homesickness.
Yes, sir.
Mm-hmm.
It was induced when, shortly before the war, I received a picture of my sweetheart.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, I can't continue.
That's all right.
The world was left terrified coming out of World War II. Germany had committed mass genocide against the Jewish people as if they were animals. The US had harnessed the power of the sun, instantly vaporizing thousands of innocent Japanese men, women, and children into thin air. And all of the men on the ground fighting came home in psychological turmoil. Many of the European refugees who moved to America due to the war were practicing psychoanalysts. They began to interview these young veterans in an effort to form a deeper understanding of what the soldiers' minds went through during the war. It started to become more clear to many of the psychoanalysts that the intense stress of battle had seemingly triggered childhood memories of violence and desires that they had suppressed for many years. As the psychoanalysts talked to more people, not just soldiers, they were astonished at the picture of the American psyche as a whole. Americans seemed to let the irrational portion of their minds play a much larger role in their lives than Europeans. The psychoanalysts' observations also pointed to a major discrepancy between the way they were feeling deep inside and the way they had appeared to feel on the surface.
Deep down, Americans were terribly sad and discontent.
I discovered the enormous role of the irrational in the lives of most people. That I can say, that I learned, that the the ratio between the irrational and the rational in America is very much in favor of the irrational. That there is much greater unhappiness, much more suffering, much more.
After seeing the raw power of the irrational mob, many powerful people were frightened at this mental health crisis. So much so, in fact, that mental health was recognized as a national problem for the first time ever when Truman signed the 1946 Mental Health Act.
There must be a way to ensure the dangers of the irrational subconscious permanently stay dormant.
Anna Freud, following the death of her father, Sigmund Freud, was determined to spread her father's ideas throughout the entire world using her psychoanalyst friends. She proposed a solution to this mental health crisis, one that she would demonstrate on the children of her good friend, Dorothy Burlingham. She believed she could strengthen their egos and teach them to control their irrational selves. Dorothy's children, Bob and Mary, both suffered from anxiety and aggression at a young age. Anna molded the environment around them and encouraged socially accepted behaviors, particularly those that would form an ideal democratic citizen, for democracy itself was no longer believed to ensure this. Hundreds of psychiatrists in the US were trained following the footsteps of Anna Freud. They opened up psychological guidance centers all over the US to combat this newfound invisible threat to democracy. They encouraged conforming to social norms to strengthen your ego and push back against dangerous hidden forces within.
I hate my brother.
Nobody ever thought to question whether suppression of the inner self could be what made the inner self dangerous. It wasn't long before big business thought this template could be used to form not only a model citizen,
but a model consumer as well.
Edward Bernays' colleague, Ernest Dichter, wanted to unveil what he called the secret self. He believed the secret self had unconscious sexual, hierarchical, and sociological motivations for buying things. He gathered people in his home to engage them in focus groups, a sort of group therapy that involves selected people trying a product or watching an ad and then discussing it with one another.
What we're going to do is try a couple of these salad dressings. Now let's see what happens. Here is our typical housewife. She doesn't follow the instructions.
He intended to unveil people's unconscious desires with certain products. One of his most notable focus groups had housewives free associate about a poorly performing Betty Crocker cake mix. What he found was that there was an unconscious guilt about the ease of an all-in-one cake mix. So he instructed Betty Crocker to come out with a new alternative cake mix that required you to add a single egg.
By adding an egg.
Simple as that.
As simple as that.
This removed this unconscious barrier of guilt, and sales for Betty Crocker skyrocketed.
It seems so much longer than last year.
It is. Nearly 4 inches longer in some models.
Oh.
Psychoanalysts soon began working for large companies all over the US utilizing the focus group as Ernest Dichter had. Soon famous writers, politicians, and movie stars all wanted to be psychoanalyzed. Even Marilyn Monroe had been working closely with a psychoanalyst friend of Anna Freud in an attempt to cure her of her depression and drug addiction using these methods. It wasn't long before psychoanalysts became very rich and powerful in America, with Bernays at the center of it all.
Number 47 said to number 3, you were the cutest jailbird I ever did see.
One of Bernays' larger clients was United Fruit, who controlled the entire banana industry in Guatemala through weak dictators that happily accepted money from United Fruit. That was until a different leader, Colonel Arbenz, was elected president of Guatemala and promised to remove United Fruit's control over the country, using the government's power to reclaim United Fruit's land. Despite Arbenz claiming to be a democratic socialist, he was immediately labeled as a communist by the US government. The CIA reached out to Bernays and was now at the center of a state-sponsored coup to overthrow the Guatemalan government. Bernays invited a few journalists who knew nothing about Guatemala to visit the country and be hosted by selected government officials claiming that Arbenz was a communist puppeted by Moscow. During their visit, there was also a violent anti-American protest that sent fear through these visiting journalists. Although lacking evidence, most people believe these protests were deliberately organized by Bernays and the United Fruit PR team.
Bernays then created a fake independent news agency called the Middle American Information Bureau
and began to pump fear into the minds of Americans that a Russian satellite existed a short distance from America's border.
In Guatemala, the Jacob Arbenz regime became increasingly communistic after its inauguration in 1951. Communists in the Congress and high governmental positions controlled major committees, labor and farm groups, and propaganda facilities. They agitated and led in demonstrations against neighboring countries and the United States.
The CIA and United Fruit then organized a rebel army and had CIA pilots drop bombs on Guatemalan cities, while Bernays framed this in the press as freedom fighters liberating the people. Soon after the coup, a member of the far-right National Liberation Movement, Carlos Armas, conveniently took Colonel Arbenz's place as the new president of Guatemala.
Vice President Nixon then visited for a stunt organized by the United Fruit's PR department,
with staged piles of Marxist literature in the presidential palace. Edward Bernays began to realize big business and government were practically one and the same, and that he could work with both for the good of the average American, who he deemed were too stupid and didn't know any better. Despite the endless efforts of the elite, the people began to doubt whether or not psychoanalysis was for the good of society or for the good of those in power. This came to a boiling point as the poster children of Anna Freud's templates met an unfortunate demise. Bob eventually died of alcoholism, and Mary killed herself. On top of that, Marilyn Monroe, who was also in the limelight for being under extensive psychoanalytic care, eventually succumbed to her sickness, committing suicide by overdose. The people finally began to ask the question postulated earlier of whether or not suppressing the inner self was in fact the source of danger.
My argument with so much psychoanalysis is the preconception that suffering is a mistake, or a sign of weakness, or a sign even of illness, when in fact, possibly the greatest truths we know have come out of people's suffering. That the problem is not to undo suffering or to wipe it off the face of the earth, but to make it inform our lives, instead of trying to cure ourselves of it constantly and avoid it. And avoid anything but that lobotomized sense of what they call happiness. There's too much of an attempt, it seems to me, to think in terms of controlling man rather than freeing him, of defining him rather than letting him go. And it's part of the whole ideology of this age, which is power mad.
As the 60s came around, an alternative school of thought was developing in some traditional psychoanalysts due to the failures of previous decades. A small group of psychoanalysts started to stray from the past and practice new theories to remedy the human mind. At the forefront of these rogue psychoanalysts was Wilhelm Reich. He held a belief that would become the mantra for many living through the coming years. Unconscious forces of the mind were fundamentally good, and it was instead the act of repression
that caused them to spoil into something rather unpleasant.
Anna Freud had, not surprisingly, developed a strong hatred towards Wilhelm Reich. His ideas went directly against what her life mission had become, which was to have her father, Sigmund Freud's ideas accepted worldwide. Anna Freud, being a very wealthy and powerful individual at the time, was able to get him kicked out of the International Psychological Association. Wilhelm Reich did coincidentally lose his mind a little bit. He believed he discovered the fundamental libidinal energy called orgone, which ultimately led him to build a gun that could capture this energy from the atmosphere. Not only that, but he also thought this technology would play a crucial role in being able to destroy UFOs that threaten the future of humanity.
But all of that is beside the point.
Despite Reich being taken out of the picture, his opinions on the unconscious mind continued to grow in the hearts of many other psychologists and young Americans at large. These sentiments were most flagrantly displayed in young, intellectual, rebellious college students. They accused large companies and advertisers of manipulating and brainwashing the public.
They began to see the more devious motives behind consumerism.
Consumerism was just as much about money as it was about making the people a docile and unquestioning mass that would comply with authority.
Advertising was manipulation. It was a way to get you to do something that didn't come out of you. It came out of somebody else. Somebody else said, this year you should be wearing powder pink shirts with matching powder pink buck shoes. And I said, why? That's not who I am. That's who somebody else is. They wanted you to be somebody who would buy their stuff. This whole feeling of being somebody else's tool. I don't want to be that. I don't want to be somebody else's man. I want to be me.
One of the very important elders of this movement was German-American philosopher and social critic Herbert Marcuse. He wrote The One-Dimensional Man, which accused psychoanalysis of creating a society in which the only way to express yourself was through the purchase of mass-produced goods. With the help of mind-altering psychedelic drugs that dissolve the barriers of reality, this group of social rebels dove headfirst into a volatile and passionate era of art and violence. This was the era of the hippies. In 1967, thousands of young Americans gathered in San Francisco to embrace counterculture, anti-war sentiments, psychedelic drugs, and love.
The Summer of Love.
Turn on, tune in, drop out. I mean drop out of high school, drop out of college, drop out of graduate school.
In 1969, 500,000 people flocked to the Woodstock Music Festival in New York to watch artists such as Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, The Who, The Grateful Dead, and Jefferson Airplane solidify themselves as musical legends.
Excuse me while I kiss this guy.
In 1963, President John F. Kennedy was shot multiple times in the head as the world watched in terror.
There was the sound of laughter, and in a moment, it was no more. And so,
in this same year, Martin Luther King delivered his famous I Have a Dream speech that fanned the flames of the civil rights movement for African Americans.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed.
Innocent protesters were hosed down and gunned down in the streets. Simultaneously, the FBI infiltrated black activist groups through COINTELPRO, pitting different groups against one another to kill each other so that the government could paint a violent picture of them to the public. The US escalated their involvement in the Vietnam War because of weak leadership, fear-mongering, and the Gulf of Tonkin incident, falsely claiming that North Vietnamese forces attacked a US naval vessel. Journalists continually exposed the horrific violation of human rights in Vietnam for all America to see. Citizens began breaking federal law and refused to comply with the draft. Anti-war protests became more and more violent. At Kent State University, a peaceful protest met opposition when the Ohio National Guard was called in, and ultimately resulted in 67 rounds being fired in a matter of 13 seconds. 4 people were killed, 2 of which were not even protesting, and 9 others were severely injured. In 1968, protests over the Vietnam War, civil rights, and police brutality broke out in the streets of Chicago. To control the protesters, also present were 12,000 police officers, 7,000 National Guardsmen, and 6,000 military soldiers. Again, this resulted in countless innocent people brutally beaten by the overwhelming power of the state. And finally, there was the very theatrical closing act to this decade with Charles Manson and his seemingly brainwashed girls killing the pregnant actress Sharon Tate along with 4 of her other companions in the comfort of hers and Roman Polanski's Hollywood estate.
It became clear to many, even the hippies, that the current approach to reforming society was in no way sustainable.
Acts of passion and violence proved to be unproductive and harmful when going up against the behemoth power of American corporatocracy, so the people had a new idea that forced themselves instead to look inward.
It's about making a new you, that if enough people changed the way they were, that the society would change.
So the personal became political?
Yes, the personal became political. Without changing the personal, you didn't stand a chance of changing the political. Coming up against the state power of the United States was not an option. I mean, they outgunned us.
As many disillusioned Americans entered the 70s, they began to turn to a new method in which they could overthrow what they saw as a corrupt and controlling society.
They would play the long game, turning inward to become individuals that represented what they believed to be an ideal society.
If enough people would do this, then society as a whole, over time, would have to follow. This was suitingly called the Human Potential Movement. At the head of this movement was German psychiatrist Fritz Perls, operating out of the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California. He utilized his novel idea of hot seat therapy, allowing individuals to express these formerly repressed inner feelings while simultaneously taking accountability for them.
I want to do for me, God damn you.
Okay. Stop it.
You. It was not phony movement. That's what I wanted to do, and I did it.
As with the 60s, they were intended to try to tackle current social issues. Some of the more intense hot seat workshops revolved around racial issues. African Americans were given the chance to express their true inner feelings towards the opposite race, and vice versa.
These often turned quite bitter and were unproductive.
I'm looking at you, Whitey. You got clothes on. You got shoes on.
You're so sure looking at me, huh?
You got the goddamn police in the neighborhood.
Really? They're not my police.
You got a governor. You got a mayor.
Oh, really?
You got the president. You got ambassadors.
You can vote, too.
You got debts in Vietnam. That's the benefits of slave labor. You got buildings, skyscrapers that you dominate and control economically and politically. And tell me that it's not yours. So don't give me no shit about I'm free. You're a goddamn liar, you white pink son of a bitch, you. Well, what did you come here for? You're sitting there with your legs all gap wide open showing your drawers. Now what'd you come here for?
Fritz Perls also experimented with these therapy sessions at the Immaculate Heart of Mary Order, which resulted in over 90% of the nuns leaving the seminary to partake in secular lifestyles. As the movement grew, institutes began to open all around the country, and more people were partaking. This quickly became a threat to corporations in America, with consumers becoming less and less predictable. It was most noticeable to insurance companies when new college graduates were buying life insurance at much lower rates than before. This new type of human wanted the ability to express themselves uniquely,
which is something that companies simply weren't offering at the time.
The companies once again turned to the focus group for further insight from their target consumers. But this time around, the consumers they needed insight from were nonconformists. They simply would not partake in the focus groups that contributed to everything they stood against. The companies and advertisers were then left to tackle this problem alone. Around this same time, a sub-movement within the Human Potential Movement began. This was led by Werner Erhard through Erhard's seminar training. He would force people to peel back layers of themselves one at a time until reaching the core.
At this core of oneself, there was nothing and no meaning.
From this enlightenment of nothing, one could reinvent themselves into whatever they desired. This delivered the final blow to the original goal of the Human Potential Movement. People were no longer interested in reforming society as a whole and became totally preoccupied with making themselves happy. There was still the daunting question that concerned corporate America of how one is able to express their individualism through consumption. No group was more determined to quantify this unpredictable consumer than the Stanford Research Institute, or SRI. The SRI enlisted one of the leaders of the human potential movement, Abraham Maslow. They used Maslow's ideas to categorize society not by social class, but rather by their driving desires. To test Maslow's theories, they conducted a series of polls inquiring about people's views towards themselves and their inner values. Not only did these polls confirm that Maslow's categories were correct, but they also confirmed that there existed a large group of individuals that cut across all social classes. This group of people defined themselves not according to their place in society, but by the choices they made. SRI was determined to quantify these individuals. After all, self-expression cannot be infinite. To do this, they came up with a new system of categorizing people, values and lifestyles, or VALs for short. Businesses could use the VALs system to identify what groups of people their consumers consisted of. They would then cater their products to exemplify the specific values held by these groups. More than anything, these companies began to sell you values and a way of life, turning them into powerful symbols for these individuals. This marketing revelation occurred during the same time as the advent of computers, allowing manufacturers to produce a variety of short-term products. Corporations had successfully re-established its symbiotic relationship with the consumer. Society had become nothing more than a group of individuals that viewed everything through the lens of personal satisfaction. It didn't take long for the politicians to catch on to this new form of individualism. This new wave of self-actualizing individuals would become the basis of presidential candidate Ronald Reagan's campaign in 1980. He believed in dissolving power of the elite in Washington and handing it over to these individuals.
I would like to take the lead in taking government off the backs of the American people and turning you loose to do what I know you can do.
When Reagan won the election, it stupefied many. The individualistic voters who won Reagan the election tended to be the same socially aware people that would have never voted conservative just a decade earlier. Democratic opponents began to worry about the direction things were headed. The right, however, continued to urge businesses and politicians to cater to the people's unconscious desires. The left retaliated, accusing the right of encouraging greed and selfishness, and claimed that they should instead be encouraging individuals to rise above their irrational mind to build a better society.
Maybe, Mr. President, if you asked a woman who had been denied the help she needed to feed her children because you said you needed the money for a tax break for a millionaire or for a missile we couldn't afford to use.
Eventually, the left had to begin to try to regain these lost voters and take back power. They turned again to the focus group. What they learned was that the people had essentially been programmed to treat the government in the same transactional way that businesses had been operating for years. If you pay your taxes, the government should in turn give you something that satiates your unconscious desires. No one was more keen on this phenomenon than British political consultant Philip Gould. Gould insisted that the British Labour Party must promise not to raise taxes in order to regain political control from the Conservatives. The Labour Party refused to budge on this fundamental principle, which cost them the election to their Conservative opponent, John Major. Gould, fed up with his party, left Britain to go to the US and instead work on Bill Clinton's campaign.
If you want a president who will restore the middle class, reclaim the future for the middle class, and restore the American dream, vote for Bill Clinton in New Hampshire and send a signal to the country that we are coming together.
What he found was Clinton had been running similar focus groups, and he actually intended on catering his policies to these powerful swing voters. Clinton promised to not raise taxes on what he called the, quote, forgotten middle class, and existing taxes would only go towards improvements of swing voters' lives, not the welfare of others. This ended up winning Clinton the election, but he realized almost immediately after getting into office that the budget deficit was far greater than he anticipated, despite taxing the rich while cutting defense budgets. He was faced with a critical decision: abandon one of the Democrats' fundamental beliefs and cut the budget for welfare, or go back on his promise of tax cuts to the middle class.
Tonight I want to talk with you about what government can do, because I believe government must do more.
He decided to maintain the old Democratic ideals, which enraged middle-class voters all over the country as they felt betrayed. His popularity rapidly plummeted. To make matters worse, his future opponent, Newt Gingrich, began to speak on promises of going back to the days of Reagan. Clinton's re-election was beginning to look hopeless. Clinton began to feel out of options as the days went on, until he turned his attention to political consultant Dick Morris.
What did he want you to do?
Save his butt.
Clinton was in serious trouble. He had lost the '94 election. He had lost control of Congress, and he hired me to come back and help save him. So he was basically asking me to perform roughly the same role as a life preserver would if you're drowning.
Morris told Clinton that they must rethink the very nature of the political landscape. They knew these suburban swing voters behaved more like consumers than anything, so they must be treated as such. For the first time ever, Dick Morris would bring lifestyles marketing into politics. To do this, Clinton's campaign turned once again to polling. Working with prominent research firms, they conducted a series of neuropersonality polls in an attempt to identify psychological types. The only political question asked
was to determine whether or not the participant was a swing voter.
Leveraging this poll data, their campaign began to cater policies only focusing on the primary desires of swing voters. Not only that, but Clinton began to even spend his leisure time partaking in the same lifestyle activities as these swing voters. Dick Morris even sent Clinton on a hunting trip dressed in the emblematic camouflage Gore-Tex outfits of the Big Sky swing voters. Liberals in Clinton's cabinet began to despise him for this new direction he was taking their party. They asked him,
"What's the point of getting reelected if you have no mandate to do anything when you're reelected?" And he'd say, "What's the point of having a mandate if you can't get reelected? Isn't the ultimate goal getting reelected?"
Despite this controversial move, it was undoubtedly effective. Clinton's ratings among swing voters began to soar. Clinton and Morris began to take things a step further and set up a call center to ask people directly if they'd be more likely to vote for Clinton if he enacted a certain policy. He would then repeat this policy on air for all to hear. Eventually, he signed a bill giving the disadvantaged a, quote, hand up, not a handout. This effectively undid the guaranteed welfare system implemented years earlier by FDR. The death of this progressive principle symbolized a new era that the liberals were entering, one that catered even more to this new individualism than Reagan. Nearly 3,000 years ago, Greek philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle spent their entire lives thinking of a new way to rule through democracy. Nearly 300 years ago, the founding fathers of this country refined these ideas into a constitution that guaranteed the fundamental rights and freedoms for citizens of the newly founded United States of America. And nearly 100 years ago, Edward Bernays created an elaborate piece of propaganda he called Democracy at the New York World Fair. Throughout the 20th century, this piece of propaganda quietly took hold of every aspect of the modern world, essentially bypassing the founding principles of democracy and freedom.
Everything that I've laid out so far in this video has essentially covered history up to the point of the invention of cell phones and social media, which is by no means a trivial moment in history, because that, I believe, is the moment when those in power finally found the proper tool to occupy every last corner of your mind. I am of the opinion that all of us vastly underestimate the level of fuckery going on with everything that's being fed to our brains. Almost everything we consume generally results in one of two things. The first thing it may do is give you a hit of dopamine. This requires zero work or discipline to receive and generates nothing useful to society in return. To be frank, it essentially numbs you into a useless member of society that is more easily controlled. The second thing it may do is enforce whatever narrative will most strongly stimulate your irrational and emotional mind. These two things have created a very problematic society, in my opinion. With little to no motivation, people are rarely willing to put in an effort to reveal the truth about the reality we live in. This makes us willing to accept whatever narrative is fed to us that is emotionally stimulating. And to add to that problem, emotionally stimulating narratives tend to be more extreme. This has left a majority of society unmotivated, docile, and participants of a mass-scale psyop enforcing a narrative of division and hate. I will explain why I believe this is an orchestrated phenomenon. It's not easy to have discussions about different ideologies with one another anymore. Let's be honest, it's almost not even possible anymore. The thing is, if we didn't have these emotional barriers preventing us from interacting, we would find that most of us are actually on the same page with a lot of things. This inability to interact is only exacerbated by the fact that most people choose to scroll on their phones as opposed to striking up conversations when the opportunity arises. We are essentially all being forced to retreat into our own heads where only irrationality and hate for one another resides. Now, let's try to imagine a society instead, where we are able to openly talk to one another and get closer to a sense of a collective truth. Well, we don't have to imagine that. I believe America was on a path to this sort of reality in the 60s. As I explained though, those in power saw this as a threat and ended the movement with fabricating division amongst activist groups and violently stomping out protesters. For those reasons, along with all the other constant propaganda and lies we've been fed since the beginning of the 20th century, I don't believe the claim that we are living in a time that's any different from the past is a bold one. In fact, I see it as the only logical conclusion. My main takeaway from diving into all of this the past couple months is that we've been tricked into thinking something other than the way we treat one another is going to lead to human progress. There is no technology, no scientific breakthrough, and no policy that is going to move us forward together. Those things may solve one problem, but another will always take its place, as has been the case since the beginning of time. Humanity will only ever truly move forward when we take on the burden to rise above our irrational minds, when we choose to respect and love one another unconditionally despite everything. Thanks for watching, and I love you all.